Picture this in your mind's eye. A lone knight, steel gleaming in the sun, charging headlong into a wall of enemies, sword raised, screaming at the heavens. That's the picture most movies have painted for us, Crusader warfare as a chaotic storm of reckless heroics. Quick pause. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? I'd love to see how far across the world this story of the Crusades is reaching. But the battlefield reality of the Crusades. It was colder, harsher, and far more calculated than the screen will ever show you. Today, we're peeling back the layers of legend to uncover the brutal, disciplined, and shockingly sophisticated truth about how Crusaders actually fought their wars. First things first, erase every Hollywood charge scene from your memory. These weren't foolish warriors rushing into certain death for the sake of glory. No, the Crusaders were methodical. They were precise. They knew survival wasn't about reckless bravery, but about discipline. Even their enemies noticed. Usama ibn Munkid, an Arab warrior who faced them firsthand, wrote with frustration, "Of all men, the Franks are the most cautious in warfare. Cautious, not fearless, not hot-blooded. Cautious." That single word flips the entire script about how these wars were really fought. And their deadliest trick? The infamous shock charge. Imagine hundreds of armored knights thundering across the field in perfect unison, lances lowered like a steel wall of death. The terror of this maneuver wasn't just the noise or the weight, it was the discipline. If even one knight broke formation, the whole attack could collapse, turning triumph into disaster. These weren't men chasing individual honor. They were parts of a larger war machine, fighting in tactical groups known as conroys. Tight-knit bands who drilled together, fought side by side, and often met their end as one. Several conroys would combine into larger battalions, giving the Crusaders a flexible, almost modern-looking military structure. And their adaptability was legendary. When the Crusaders first faced Muslim horse archers, mounted warriors who rained arrows from a distance and melted away before you could touch them, most armies would have crumbled. But not the Crusaders. They borrowed tactics straight out of Byzantine manuals and, astonishingly, executed them flawlessly on their very first attempt. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't desperation. It was cold, professional soldiering from men who knew that bending meant survival. But let's shift focus to their armor, because the reality of what these men wore into battle is as punishing as the fighting itself. During the First Crusade, a typical knight strapped on a leather or cloth coat reinforced with metal scales, layered over by long-sleeve chain mail with mittens and a collar to protect the throat. On his head sat a cone-shaped helmet with a narrow nose guard, making him look like some grim metal falcon ready to strike. Impressive? Yes. Comfortable in the sweltering Middle Eastern sun? Absolutely not. Marching across desert sands in this gear was like dragging a personal furnace along with you. So the Crusaders adapted again. They swapped heavy layers for lighter chainmail and stuffed cotton-padded caps beneath their helmets to soak up sweat and heat. Even then, their equipment was crushing. Between broadswords, shields, lances, and full armor, a Crusader was weighed down like a walking arsenal. Fast, nimble movement wasn't an option. This turned every clash into a brutal race against exhaustion. Could they smash through their opponents before heat, thirst, or sheer fatigue claimed them first? Archaeology paints the picture even clearer. Excavations at medieval battlefields, like the site of the Battle of Tun, reveal skulls with multiple brutal head wounds. That tells us everything. Chain mail and armor shielded the torso, so warriors aimed high. Helmets weren't decoration. They were the only thing standing between life and a swift, bloody death. Even the poorest foot soldiers made sure their heads were covered, because stepping onto a battlefield bareheaded was practically suicide. But fighting in open fields was only one side of the Crusader experience. The real test of their endurance came in siege warfare. Forget the quick, dramatic victories you've seen in films. Most Crusader campaigns dragged on for months, sometimes years, grinding down both sides. Take the infamous siege of Acre during the Third Crusade. For nearly 2 years, Crusader forces stared up at towering walls and sky-high battlements that seemed invincible. And yet, instead of rushing blindly, they set about building their own miniature fortress around the city. Ditches, moats, wooden defenses, a siege camp so large and elaborate it became a city within a city. This was the Crusaders' true strength. Not wild heroics, but relentless discipline, clever adaptation, and the sheer will to outlast their enemies. Behind the myths of lone knights and shining glory lies the cold reality of warriors who fought like professionals, endured like machines, and changed the art of war for centuries to come. They knew from the very start that storming a fortress wasn't about wild courage or reckless charges. It was a slow art that demanded patience, engineering, and above all, endless resources. When fresh reinforcements sailed in from Europe, they didn't just bring more swords and bodies. They hauled in lumber, iron, and ropes, the very bones of siege engines. The French contingent, for instance, spent months burrowing under the base of Acre's towering defenses, digging dangerous tunnels that threatened to bring down stone walls that had stood for centuries. Meanwhile, above ground, other Crusaders worked feverishly to assemble monstrous catapults so massive they earned names of their own. One infamous machine, christened by the French as God's own sling, could hurl boulders large enough to splinter fortress towers like clay pots. Yet as terrifying as these war machines were, they weren't the true secret behind the Crusaders' eventual success at Acre. No, the hidden key was something far less glamorous: logistics. While Saladin's army made desperate attempts to shatter the siege from the outside, the Crusader lines held fast, continually replenished by ships carrying supplies, reinforcements, and endless stores of ammunition. The Muslims, caught in a chokehold between the city's defenders and the encircling Crusaders, found themselves unable to properly support either side. And this brings us to the part of Crusader warfare that Hollywood never dares to touch: the all-consuming importance of supply lines. Centuries after Rome's fall, Europe had forgotten the genius of Roman logistics, and Crusader armies had to rediscover it through bitter trial in the scorching deserts of the Middle East. The brutal truth was this: a soldier could carry roughly a week's rations on his back, but his horse could carry nothing for itself. War horses and pack animals required 4 to 6 hours of grazing each day, which meant every march had to revolve around the location of grass and water. In the end, many Crusader hosts weren't cut down by enemy blades, but by gnawing hunger and poisoned wells. Muslim commanders, especially the cunning Saladin, understood this weakness all too well and wielded it like a weapon sharper than steel. When Richard the Lionheart arrived in the Holy Land, he changed the game. Unlike his predecessors, Richard treated logistics with almost obsessive care. Instead of starving in the desert like earlier armies, he had supply ships shadow his march along the coast, ensuring his soldiers were never far from food and fresh water. But Saladin, no less brilliant, matched Richard move for move. When the English king turned inland toward Jerusalem, he discovered that Saladin had already scorched the earth before him. Wells had been fouled, crops torched, livestock driven off. The land transformed into a barren wasteland. Richard realized that even with one of the most disciplined and well-supplied armies ever sent to the Holy Land, an assault on Jerusalem would mean watching his men die by inches, parched and starving under the sun. In the end, logistics forced him into retreat. The battlefield had become a chessboard, and two of the greatest military minds of their age had locked each other into checkmate without ever striking the decisive blow. The contrast with Muslim armies was striking. Crusader supply lines stretched across thousands of dangerous miles, while Muslim forces moved with self-sufficient columns of camels and mules. Their trains carried not only grain and weaponry, but surgeons, doctors, and medical equipment, an advantage that gave them endurance in the endless wars of attrition. But what about when all this planning, all these supply lines and siege engines, finally gave way to combat? Here, archaeology offers a grim window into truths the chronicles only hint at. At Sidon Castle in Lebanon, excavations uncovered the remains of Crusader-era soldiers, bones that bore the ugly marks of their violent ends. These weren't clean duels with flashing swords like you see in movies. Some skulls had been hacked from behind, their spines severed mid-flight, proof they were cut down while fleeing. Others showed deep cleaving wounds across the neck, executions by beheading, likely carried out on prisoners after the fighting was done. These discoveries destroy the romantic image of knights in noble combat. When formations collapsed, when the iron discipline snapped, medieval battle devolved into chaos. There was no honor, only slaughter. Death often came not to the bravest, but to the unlucky, the ones trampled, the ones too slow, the ones who lost their place in line. Soldiers struck wherever armor was weakest, faces, necks, joints, and those wounds still scar the bones dug from the soil 8 centuries later. That is the harsh reality of Crusader warfare. It wasn't divine intervention or sacred bravery that kept those armies moving forward. It was cold, calculated organization. A machine built on logistics, discipline, and an almost merciless efficiency. The true myth of the Crusades doesn't live in shining ballads about holy knights or grand tales of destiny. It survives in siege records, in dusty ledgers of supply lists, in accounts of ships ferrying grain and stone across treacherous seas. And it lingers in the silent skeletons of soldiers who perished beneath the walls of castles they never breached. So, the next time you picture a Crusader knight, remember the darker details. Poisoned wells, armies starving in the desert, cavalry charges that only worked if every single rider held formation, and massive war machines with names like God's own sling. And remember, too, the nameless young men whose bones still bear the scars of their final, desperate fight. What do you think? Does the reality of the Crusades make them more fascinating than the legends, or does it strip away their sense of glory? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you want more than myths, if you want the raw, unvarnished truth of the Middle Ages, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. Because here, we don't just retell history's greatest stories. We reveal the grit, the struggle, and the humanity hidden behind the legends.